One word to describe John Howard?
A single word.
That is for others.
Reliable.
Committed.
Great.
Decent.
What if it's the same as other people's words?
Grand.
Strong, actually.
Sound.
The consummate politician.
I think you'll get the same words over and over again.
Tenacious.
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 Well, I don't argue with that.
I think guts.
Gutsy.
I don't argue with that.
Inspirational.
That's nice.
Magnificent.
Well, that's even better.
Well, I think the one I'll say you'll have heard before.
Determined.
Determined.
Constant.
Conviction.
Conviction.
One word to describe John Howard. Relentless.
After 13 years in the political wilderness, the Liberal Party was back in power. At last, John Howard had the chance to reshape the nation according to the values he held most dear.
He loves the flag, John Howard. He put the flag on his car. Menzies had the flag on his car.
Morning, Prime Minister. Good morning.
He was always a great believer in those symbols. He's a sort of a nationalist, which was a bit odd for a Liberal Party leader. Whether or not the Australian flag or things like Gallipoli, he had a real passion for them.
I, John Winston Howard, do swear that I will well and truly serve the people of Australia. I came to the Prime Ministership with some very clear views as to where I wanted to take the country.
And in comes John Howard and he says, look, he values families, he values small business, he values hard work. John Howard is a bit like a safe uncle, and we'll put him in there. He's not going to do anything wrong. In fact, he'd probably do a lot of things right.
In winning the 1996 election, John Howard snatched Labor's heartland with a 45-seat majority.
Congratulations. Thank you, Alan. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Most impressive performance. You must be very pleased. I am. It was
Bigger and more comprehensive than I had expected. I would not have won the victory that I did on Saturday without probably 40% of trade unionists voting for the Liberal and National Party.
I think the nature of his victory gave him enormous power within the party. He led, others listened and followed.
I definitely remember him saying to the party room that, when you change the government, you change the country.
That was certainly the perception within the office. Gee, we're finally there, The barbarians have stormed the gates, they've got into the castle, and what's here?
What they found was a group of public servants who'd worked closely with the former Labor government. Things were set to change. Within his first week as Prime Minister, John Howard sacked not one, but 6 department heads. He would handpick the country's most senior bureaucrats.
I was telephoned on the Friday after the election. The Prime Minister wanted me to become Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And I asked what was happening to my predecessor. No, your predecessor's already gone. He's been sacked.
It was as if the whole public service was going to be turned on its head.
Became celebrated in Canberra as the so-called Night of the Long Knives, but that was essentially a decision of the PM.
John Howard was making his mark. But a rude shock would stop the Prime Minister in his tracks. An unexpected $9 billion budget deficit.
I thought, crikey, this is going to be tough. I knew then that we were going to have a very tough year and a tough number of years.
The responsibility of the budget fell to the young Treasurer. Peter Costello was about to be tested.
Well, we're in Sydney at the Commonwealth Parliament offices, and Peter went into that meeting looking fairly relaxed, and he came out looking ashen-faced, and he was genuinely shocked at the size of the deficit.
You know, I felt like, you know, I was the bloke that had been passed the parcel, and this parcel was ticking. And the guy that had put the ticking time bomb inside the parcel had left the scene. And if I didn't fix it quickly, it would explode in my face. I never expected to be in this position.
Peter Costello and Finance Minister John Fahey now had to get down to the brutal business of slashing government programs.
I guess it bonded us. It bonded me and John Fahey. And what I remember was the bitter cold Canberra winter and the days and nights in the windowless, airless cabinet bunker.
It was intense, it was difficult, it was taxing.
And I contented myself with this. I thought, you know, maybe this would end my political career. You know, these budget cuts would be so unpopular, but I contented myself with the idea I would have done something for Australia.
One by one, the ministers come forward, they put their proposals. Most of them wanted to spend. Very few volunteered savings.
There were times when there were stand-up brawls. There were times when ministers walked out.
As the ministers argued, one man stood above it all, John Howard.
Your first budget's got to send a clear message, and the clear message was that we were a reformist government.
He would always reserve the right to review the decisions we took. And if he didn't like them, he would give us reasons, and again, Prime Ministers have the last say.
I used to say to him, John, look, we just spent far too much money on sport. You know, cut back some of that stuff. You know, people want to play sport, they can pay for it themselves. He'd look down the cabinet table at me and he'd say, are you mad? He'd say.
John Howard was saying, we're going to cut everywhere, we're not going to cut defence. And I kept coming back to him and saying, look, this is silly. You know, 20,000 we might be cutting out of CWA. And you got this whole defence budget. And we had this argument, and he said, in the end, he said, indulge me, I'm the Prime Minister.
Only 8 weeks into his Prime Ministership, a devastating event in Tasmania would overwhelm the government and the nation.
Apparently there's a man gone berserk with a gun down at the store.
At the kiosk?
They believe the man walked into a cafeteria at the Port Arthur Historic Village, opening fire with a semi-automatic rifle.
I grabbed my youngest daughter and I was running like hell. I was crouched, and I was just looking through the car windows to see which way he's going, and he was following us. I thought I was dead.
With 35 people dead, the 28th of April 1996 was the darkest of days.
This is an event that has shaken the core of this country, and in a way that no other individual crime has done in my lifetime.
The nightmare unfolded around 2:30 this afternoon. A lone gunman, armed with a high-powered rifle, entered the...
One of those sickening days when the news actually makes you feel disturbed and sickened in the stomach.
Eyewitnesses said the gunman appeared excited, but was in total control of
I was totally and utterly thunderstruck that there could be such an appalling loss of life at the hands of one man in this desolate, tiny part of Australia. It really rocked the nation in an incredible way. It affected me.
John Howard embraced a new role as the nation's mourner-in-chief.
I talked as best I can from one Australian to another, and I'm sure inadequately expressed my sense of sorrow.
I think it showed a side to John Howard that people hadn't really understood. His capacity to relate to them.
And very sort of non-John Howard, but in reality, that was him. And immediately he said, we've got to do something about guns.
I can remember discussing this issue with some of my staff, and one or two of them said to me, you're not really thinking of banning all semi-automatics, are you? And I said, yes. I said, we might as well go for broke on this.
The cabinet was quite divided on it. And mostly it was divided along city-rural lines. And, you know, sitting around the cabinet table were people who actually owned a lot of guns.
The Prime Minister rang me early one morning, just a few days after Port Arthur, and said, well, now, we're going to have to do something, as you know, about gun laws. He said, your job is to explain to me and convince me as to what sort of firearms farmers need and legitimately must have access to. What sort of gun do you use? And I hesitated for a moment because I thought I don't quite know how to tell the Prime Minister that I have what he would regard as an arsenal.
We realised that Howard wasn't going to change his mind. I mean, you could give your arguments against the gun control and you knew he would listen to you politely and he would be patient with you, but you knew you were talking to a brick wall. He was not going to change his mind.
And I have to say I was annoyed on occasions that he didn't seem prepared to make even little compromises for those whom I felt had put up a reasonable argument.
I mean, if I'd backed off, I'd have looked hopeless and weak, and people would have thought, well, you know, he's not fair dinkum. How many more people need to be murdered by a madman to convince the government to do something? Those sorts of things, if you don't deal with them decisively, they weaken people's faith in the institution of governments.
You can send a message all the way down to Canberra to that sawn-off little dickhead, Jackboot Johnny.
I'm not worried about anything.
Persuading the Bush to embrace gun reform was a test of John Howard's political skill as he went head-to-head with rural Australia.
The only currency that you can purchase freedom back with is blood.
There was white-hot anger from those opposed, and they expressed it by white feathers in envelopes, threatening letters, emails, and some very colourful meetings.
Shooters arrived early at Melbourne's Domain to register their protest against proposed national gun laws.
We are not guilty of what happened in Tasmania.
They marched up Sydney's Macquarie Street and on to the New South Wales Parliament. Organisers claim 100,000 people turned out.
I have not changed my views. I will not be changing my views.
This was an occasion where a Prime Minister confronted his core constituency, the people who brought John Howard to power.
The Prime Minister wasn't about to back off, but in Sale, Victoria, he received a warning. A warning that made clear the kind of emotions he'd unleashed.
Head of security came to the Prime Minister and he said, PM, we've just had a report that we've never had before. This is really, really serious.
The AFP tell me they've had a quite explicit warning. The local police have had a quite explicit warning that somebody's going to shoot you.
And they were saying, you know, we get lots of reports, but this one is more dangerous than anything we've ever had. And will you please wear this flak jacket?
And you've got to wear it or not go to the meeting. And I said, well, this is ridiculous.
I don't know if they're right or wrong, but I have no idea how I would go and tell Jeanette and your family that we were warned for you to wear this flak jacket. You didn't, and you got shot. I have just no idea how I would say that to your family.
I'm sorry about that, but there is no other way. There is no other way. Bullshit, Johnny! And it is always...
You know, I grumbled and I argued with him, and in the end I thought, oh, well, this is stupid, I might as well wear it. And I'm sorry I did. I really am. I felt a bit of a goose afterwards for having worn it.
But that is an element of turning around the culture in this country, and that is the reason why the government has taken the decision that it has taken.
But John Howard's dogged determination paid off. 3 months after declaring a war on guns, the Prime Minister had won the day.
I had a different impression of John Howard when that was over than perhaps I had prior to that event. I thought this man has proportions I didn't really understand.
The Prime Minister's resolve to deliver uniform gun laws inflamed his rural supporters.
The gun debate had made things tinder dry. The political collateral an incoming government ought to enjoy for 12 months had suddenly evaporated.
Well, I have a message for the Liberal and Labor. There is a new girl on the block.
The disaffected found a new voice, one that spoke directly to them.
And she intends to give them hell.
If there is any one single factor that triggered support for Pauline Hanson, it was the guns debate. Those people went over to One Nation, appalled that they had been betrayed by the Liberal and National parties.
She was able to parley gun ownership back into this anti-Canberra, anti-elite, anti-special welfare campaign that she was on.
This suggestion that without guns we wouldn't have got Pauline Hanson is not something that I accept for a moment.
I call the honourable member for Oxley.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Speaker. In making my first speech...
When Pauline Hanson first spoke in the House of Representatives, guns were not her target. Others were in her sights.
I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians. Of course I will be called racist, but if I can invite who I want into my home, then I should have the right to have a say in who comes into my country.
Now, you've got to remember that Hanson had been sacked by us as a candidate. So when I heard these comments, I thought to myself, well, that's why she was sacked.
Wake up, Australia, before it's too late.
It was just a diatribe of bitterness and hatred and factually incorrect statements that I knew were ones that had to be countered and countered very quickly.
But John Howard remained silent.
My view, however, was that a full frontal attack from the Prime Minister only elevated it.
"12 days after Pauline Hanson gave her maiden speech, the Prime Minister made a speech of his own to the Queensland Liberal Party.
One of the great changes that has come over Australia in the last 6 months is that people do feel able to speak a little more freely and a little more openly about what they feel. In a sense, the pall of censorship on certain issues has been lifted.
Those already suspicious of John Howard's views on race believed he'd given Pauline Hanson the prime ministerial stamp of approval.
In Queensland, to talk about lifting the pall of censorship when Hanson was the person that was actually on fire, in my view, was to give the wrong speech in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it showed an ambivalence that he always had in relation to the views of Pauline Hanson.
And I did make some remarks about a pall of censorship being lifted. And those remarks were not designed to give a green light to Pauline Hanson or indeed anybody else, but they were a statement of what I believed.
Prime Minister, and I might add the Treasurer, throughout all of that, stood steadfast in the view that if you ignored her, she would lose oxygen and ultimately wither.
Sure, ignore her if that's going to put out the flame, but after the flames burned brightly, you've got to actually take the issue on. And I think we should have taken the issue on earlier.
John Howard's cabinet colleagues broke rank and condemned Pauline Hanson. The Prime Minister would not tolerate public dissent.
I remember one occasion when there was something in the paper that reporting what I'd said about Pauline Hanson, and I got a call from the Prime Minister quite near question time. I had the phone out here and could still hear clearly what he was saying. He was clearly agitated and tense and angry.
We must absolutely reject old-fashioned, racist, elitist attitudes. I made a speech attacking Pauline Hanson pretty vehemently. I think I'm right in saying this. In nearly 12 years as the Foreign Minister, I think it's pretty much the only time he's rung me to chastise me, but he wasn't too impressed with it because he said, well, you know, it's just going to leave me out there and people are going to say, well, you know, the media are going to say, well, Downer's doing the right thing, why doesn't Howard?
Among initial coverage, some strong editorial alarm bells.
The Pauline Hanson saga continues.
$8 billion a year in export earnings have been jeopardised by the race debate.
A growing backlash in the Asian media left the Prime Minister unmoved.
I think in a few months' time, people are going to look back and say, what was that all about?
There were a few cables that came in from overseas, from predictable sources, saying this is dreadful and it's, you know, it's getting some media coverage.
You know, I made it my business to ensure that, you know, Graham Morris saw bundles of cables, bundles of press reports.
But when you actually talk to Asian leaders or when you actually looked at what was going on, it was just a few bureaucrats cutting out newspapers saying, you know, this is shock horror, it's destroying Australians' reputation. Rubbish.
The reaction in Southeast Asia was really quite adverse, strongly adverse, to the statements that were being made by Pauline Hanson. So it's not just possible to dismiss those diplomatic cables, to dismiss the press reports.
The Prime Minister has made his strongest attack yet on independent MP Pauline Hanson's anti-Asian stand.
7 months after Pauline Hanson's maiden speech, John Howard finally shifted strategy, speaking out against her.
She is wrong when she says that Australia is in danger of being swamped by Asians. She is wrong to seek scapegoats for society's problems.
And after he'd made the statement, Graham Morris came across the room and I was at a separate table and he said, "Are you satisfied now, Philip? Are you happy now?" And I said to him, it was an excellent statement, but it was 7 months too late.
So what sort of a budget will it be?
Well, it will be a strong, fair budget.
Tough?
Strong and fair.
Costello certainly isn't playing down his first budget.
If we don't do the hard yards now, the problems are going to get worse.
If gun laws and Pauline Hanson had strained John Howard's bond with the battlers,
There's a face I know.
his government's first budget was about to alienate many others.
It's a good balance, that's an excellent amount.
The 1996 budget was both praised and pilloried. There were drastic cuts to universities and labour market programs. The public service was downsized and the Commonwealth Employment Service was privatised.
The day before the budget, there was a riot on Parliament House. The Commonwealth Police locked me in my office to protest about the balancing of the budget. I knew what was in the budget, and I thought to myself, if they're rioting before they've seen it, imagine what they'll be doing after they've seen it.
The budgets of the ABC and the Office of the Status of Women were cut. Indigenous Affairs also felt the razor. Funding for ATSIC was slashed.
These sort of cuts are defensible, they are fair, they do not decimate Aboriginal funding, they do not represent some kind of financial genocide, as one person alleged, and I think the whole debate should just simmer down.
But relations between the Aboriginal community and the Prime Minister were about to boil over.
There was a lot of suspicion within the Aboriginal communities about what we might do with native title. Native title had been of huge symbolic importance to Aboriginal people.
Then, on the 23rd of December 1996, the High Court recognised the Wik people's native title rights.
That is the Christmas present I'll take to the Wik people.
But there was no celebration at Kirribilli House when John Howard heard the news. The Wik decision established native title could coexist with a pastoral lease.
It sent shockwaves through, you know, the government and the legal system entirely, because so much of Australia is covered by pastoral leases.
Now, that was a very difficult period, and I tried very hard to reach an accommodation between the various groups.
Farmers and miners, fearful they would lose their land, were outraged.
We deserve our own land rights and we prefer total extinguishment.
And we feel that they've just let us down and they've been actually treacherous.
To appease them, the Prime Minister's solution, a 10-point plan aimed at watering down the Native Title Act.
You know, they were suddenly up in arms about what does all this mean. So it really, you know, was the cat in the henhouse.
In May 1997, John Howard and his deputy went to Longreach in Queensland's Central West to explain the Prime Minister's plan. They encountered a furious mob.
Ladies and gentlemen, I also recognise that there are no simple solutions.
I remember walking up those steps with John Howard and others, and you know when a crowd is smouldering and ready to belt you up.
Please don't believe this fear-mongering that says native title claimants can throw you off your property. They can't. We will never, ever allow that to happen.
Well, I certainly felt that the pendulum had to come back somewhat towards the pastoralist and miner side, and particularly given that our working assumption until the High Court decision had been that the grant of a pastoral lease extinguished native title.
To say that Indigenous people's rights can be extinguished and obliterated and never return by a government led by Howard was not going to help bridge any gaps.
Can I say how very pleased I am to be here today to formally open this convention?
9 days after the Longreach meeting, John Howard travelled to Melbourne for the Aboriginal Reconciliation Convention. Like the farmers, this audience had deep concern about the government's response to the Wik decision. The Prime Minister's speech began in a conciliatory tone.
Personally, I feel deep sorrow for those of my fellow Australians who suffered injustices under the practices of past generations towards Indigenous people. Equally, I am sorry for the hurt and trauma many people here today
The applause soon exploded into anger when the Prime Minister justified his 10-point plan.
I also need to, in the name of truth and the name of a frank discussion of this issue, to repudiate the claim that my 10-point plan involves a massive handout of freehold title at taxpayer expense. That is an absolute myth. It is absolutely contrary to the fact, and I absolutely repudiate it. So ladies and gentlemen, I believe...
It was awful footage. He looked as if he was under pressure, and he was. You know, he was being heckled, he was trying to be heard above the din, he was shouting, they were shunning him. It was supposed to be a moment of reconciliation, and it turned into a moment, really, of division.
I probably shouldn't have reacted as energetically as I did, and it would have made for better television.
I have great pleasure in formally declaring this convention open. Thank you.
I tried to reassure him that, you know, we've still got a great process, that we have to arise above the differences that we've got if we're going to heal this nation in any serious way. He wasn't interested in that, and in fact I walked him back off the stage at the end of the proceedings to his car. He didn't say a word to me. He did not say a word to me. He was furious. He walked at a great pace and left.
John Howard doesn't get rattled, but it was an awkward period because you could just sense that some people were starting to say, would this be a one-term government? And, you know, John Howard has worked so hard to get to become Prime Minister. He still had 50 million things he wanted to do.
There was one issue John Howard was hell-bent on tackling: reform of the waterfront.
The reform of the waterfront was holy grail for the Howard government. And we realised when we got into government, in fact we realised before we were in government, when we were in opposition, that we really only had one window to make the reform, and that was in our first term.
There was a legendary scorn about the inefficiency of the Australian waterfront. You know, the famous story about the lady in Charleville who's told that there's a cyclone coming, and she says, "Oh, don't worry, the wharfies won't land it."
I mean, the idea that Australia could have a worse waterfront record than some landlocked country in Africa, which was, you know, one of the more extreme examples we had, but which was true.
The waterfront was always two-pronged. One was to improve the economy, to improve our exports, but the other was that it was a totemic issue to try to reduce union power in this country.
John Howard's first step was to change the workplace laws. Compulsory unionism was banned, and the government imposed massive fines on any union that staged an illegal strike. The Maritime Union of Australia was the government's target.
Well, one of the justifications for reform would be a strike on the waterfront initiated by the unions over some really ridiculous thing, as is often the case.
That then would allow the IR legislation to come into play, allow a dismissal of the workforce, and allow a new workforce to come in.
But John Howard knew changing the laws was not enough.
Are you able to talk to me now, or...?
The government needed an insider, a tough-minded businessman who shared their firm resolve to break the union's monopoly. That man, Chris Corrigan.
There was absolutely no chance of a negotiated outcome or of a gradual change. This industry will only change with a radical solution.
On the 12th of March 1997, Chris Corrigan met with Peter Reith and John Sharp.
Sorry, I'm late. I simply said to them, this is not going to be done in a conventional way. The only way to keep the waterfront functioning is to have an alternate workforce, and that workforce is not going to be trained satisfactorily in Australia.
12 days later, John Sharp and Peter Reith took a radical plan to the Prime Minister. John Howard signed off on what would become known as the interventionist strategy.
Although Peter Reith and John Sharp were running the policy on a day-to-day operational level, I was very heavily involved because I wanted this reform achieved.
You know, the first big dispute under the Howard government was going to be the test of metal. And having John Howard on side was, from my point of view, it was it.
6 months passed. On the 18th of September 1997, a meeting was called in Treasury Place, Melbourne, to discuss the progress of waterfront reform. Chris Corrigan had been busy planning an alternate workforce.
I had an obligation, in my view, to tell them certain things, to tell them the broad outline of what I was contemplating, and in particular to tell them that my plans may well result in significant redundancies on the waterfront. And I think I had an obligation to tell them that. As I say, you can't bring the country to a grinding halt, you know, and just leave the government in the dark.
And Chris Corrigan made this perfectly clear. They'll be in a position to sack the workforce under the new legislation, and if he had to sack the workforce, he would require new labour.
In a separate meeting with John Sharp and Peter Reith, Chris Corrigan revealed exactly what he wanted. He needed money, government money, to fund redundancy payments for sacked workers.
I put it to them in much more specific terms what I required and the scale of the numbers that were involved.
Okay.
The scale was something like 150 million for us alone in terms of redundancy payments.
I remember saying to myself, well, I suppose we'll have to sign up to the industry standard on redundancies. But it was incredibly generous. I mean, it was just completely over the top, basically.
With the funds guaranteed, Chris Corrigan could proceed with his top secret plan to train an alternate workforce. The location? Dubai.
I want to make it absolutely clear, I never told anybody in government that I had arrangements for people to be trained in Dubai. Never.
My memory of it is that Chris was looking. He was thinking about setting up a third-party workforce. He was looking at training them in a number of places, both in Australia and offshore, and Dubai would have been one of those possible offshore sites.
I don't think I even knew Dubai was a port, you know. Shocking ignorance, I suppose. I just hadn't done enough flying, I suppose.
Keeping a plan like this under wraps was never going to be easy. 2 months later, it blew. An unknown source contacted the head of the MUA, John Coombs.
And he then told me that Dubai was going to be the place that was going to be trained. They didn't have a date of departure, but they had a number of ex-army and ongoing servicemen that were going to be sent to Dubai. And that's when I asked the question, where is this starting from? He said, where would you like to start? I said, well, at the top. He said, John Howard.
On the 3rd of December 1997, the government was forced to answer questions about the nature of its involvement.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Workplace Relations and Small Business. Have you or any member of your staff or department or any consultant advising the government on waterfront matters had any discussions with Michael Wells, Peter Kilfoyle...
You know, the Labor Party were asking me these questions in the House about all these, you know, shelf companies, which I'd never heard of. I mean, just knew nothing, and names of people I'd never heard of. It wasn't as if I'd had somebody ring up and say, well, Mr Reith, we've planned this huge operation and, you know, we've got cranes organised and we've got 50 blokes or whatever it was. I mean, I obviously had no information of that sort.
The Honourable Minister for Workplace Relations and Small Business.
Mr Speaker, I must say I don't know any of those names of either the companies or the individuals that the member has asked me of, so the answer is no.
Well, I think Peter would have known that there was a plan to train people. And what Peter was doing that day was focusing on one part of the question, not answering the whole of the question, which is very stock in trade in politics.
I actually rang up Corrigan and P&O, Richard Hine, and said, well, what do you blokes know about this?
And he said to me, you better tell me, are you training people in Dubai?
Both of them basically said, well, it's not us. I think that was the answer I got.
And I said, well, I don't know that I want to tell you that, but if you're asking me deliberately, yes.
The plan was exposed. The government was now under fire.
Prime Minister, would you be prepared to use mercenaries on the wharves?
What an extraordinary question.
Well, this has been raised in lately.
I'm in favour of everything that's strictly in accordance with the laws of Australia.
The union movement mobilised its members, calling on its vast networks to stop the Dubai enterprise in its tracks.
Instead of Reith saying it's a defining moment in industrial relations, it'll be a defining moment, the beginning of the end of the careers of Reith and Howard proprietors. That was the most significant rebut of the government and Patrick's attempts to replace our workforce. We got them expelled, kicked out of Dubai. They were all the next morning in Singapore on their way home.
Johnny Howard is his name. Johnny Howard is his name. Busting unions is his game. Busting unions is his game. Reith is in in the caper too. Reith is in the caper too.
Chris Corrigan wasn't going to be outfoxed by the unions. He struck a deal with the MUA's traditional foe, the National Farmers Federation.
I would lease them facilities and they could achieve what I'd, in a sense, been unsuccessful in achieving, namely training a workforce.
On the 7th of April 1998, at 11 p.m, Chris Corrigan executed his plan. He ordered security guards with dogs onto the docks and sacked the union workforce, 1,400 people across the country. They were locked out and replaced with non-union labour.
The dogs were my idea because at the end of the day, I absolutely knew that these people, if they were allowed to stay there for very long, they would set about vandalising the equipment. If they vandalised the equipment, the waterfront would be shut down for months.
We were satisfied and were given assurances that it was legal, what was going to be done. We knew it was direct. We knew it was going to cause a lot of skin and hair to fly.
My memory of it is I didn't even know until right at the moment, basically. Literally at the moment. I can't even remember what time of the day that was now.
But if Peter Reith can't recall, events of the night tell another story. At 11 p.m, exactly the same time security guards entered the docks, his staff issued a press release. The government would provide $250 million to pay all sacked workers. The battle was now on. For the next few months, Australia's waterfront became the focus of a bitter and violent struggle.
Has there ever been a genuine, decent, biffo on the waterfront when there hasn't been a lot of emotion and a lot of aggression and where it hasn't been tough for both sides? So you could say, well, the government took a beating. Well, every government's taken a beating in the past on waterfront reform. We took a bit more beating than usual, but then again, we're the only ones who ever got anything done either.
The MUA took the fight all the way to the High Court in an attempt to have their workers reinstated by Patrick's. In time, they would win the court battle and many were re-employed, but only after signing new productivity agreements in line with Chris Corrigan's original demands.
It's one of those great things where everybody claims victory. The Maritime Union preserved a near monopoly of their domination of the waterfront. We got significant increases in profitability. I look back with tremendous pride and just say, we achieved far more than, frankly, I would have hoped to have got.
Chris Corrigan would celebrate, but Peter Reith felt under siege, believing his cabinet colleagues had abandoned him.
Quite frankly, half the rest of the team you never heard from them anyway, and I was pretty isolated, I don't mind telling you, but I only had the one bloke really on side, and he was the only one I really needed.
Let me say this, that it would have been very helpful if a number of senior cabinet ministers at the time had come out and supported him.
A beleaguered Peter Reith visited the Prime Minister at Kirribilli.
Look, here are the options. You could get rid of me.
And I said, no, under no circumstances. See it through, you're doing it well, and you have my total support.
I'll tell you what he said to me. He said, oh, my kids think you're great, which, it's a sort of a more emotional way of saying, I'm still supporting you, because when John Howard says his kids support you, well, you got Jeanette as well. I mean, that's pretty good.
Never ever, never ever, never ever, ever, never ever, ever.
Morning, Mr. Howard.
G'day, Anthony.
How are you, Will?
John Howard was changing the country,
I feel like quite a celebrity, Mr. Howard.
but by the middle of his first term, the electorate was turning away from John Howard.
Good to see you. All the best.
The Prime Minister had to woo the voters back.
What are you doing in our country, John? Very un-Australian.
Nice to see you. How are you, mate?
I made the observation to a friend and colleague at the time that it took the Liberal Party 13 years to work out how to get into government. And I hope that it didn't take them 13 years to work out how to govern, because they didn't have that amount of time.
Hello, Mr. Prime Minister.
How are you, Loretta?
Well, I'm fine, thank you, and I'm a former total Liberal supporter of yours. I hate to say I'm not anymore.
Why is that?
What John Howard needed was a cause to champion. What he chose would shock his party.
We have a tax system that discourages savings. In a word, our tax system is holding us back.
It was the never-ever GST.
He felt there had to be change to the tax system. But there was no great discussion about this. There was no great plan. Hey, fellas, if we do a GST and whatnot, what will that mean? Let's have the bureaucracy work on it, all of that sort of stuff. Because the minute you start doing that, those sort of things like...
There's no doubt that at some stage, sooner or later, we will have to reform the Australian taxation system.
Does that include revisiting
well,
GST?
You can't have a reform unless you look at all of the options. Now,
I will never forget the moment I listened to the Prime Minister on Sunday television announcing that we're about to embark upon a new tax system underpinned by a GST. I suspect at that moment that the expletive that came out of my mouth came out of the mouth of many colleagues around Australia, and I remember saying to my wife when I finally composed myself, fasten your seatbelt, we're in for a rough ride.
I want to share this great adventure with the Australian. I was arguing for something that I believed in, and that is tremendously important in politics. If you've really got something to hang on to and to fight for and argue for, the conviction comes through.
Hello there. Leslie? Good afternoon.
It changed his body language overnight. You know, from someone looking defensive, uncertain, all of a sudden he was a man who had got back into his stride.
Sure.
With a 45-seat majority, this would be the Prime Minister's best chance to get his tax reform through.
Arthur Sinadinos, my Chief of Staff, often used the expression that this was like having an 800-pound gorilla loose in an election campaign.
And he said, Gazard, we've taken a boat, we've sailed it down the coast of Africa, we've gone into the jungle, we've pulled out the meanest, nastiest gorilla we could find, sailed back to Australia and let it loose on the streets.
It was Peter Costello's job to tame the beast.
And then we embarked on setting up a group that would start drawing the tax plan. We put them in a separate building and we locked them up. We gave them separate passes. Only people that were engaged on the tax plan were allowed into that building. They were not to talk to any of their colleagues in the Treasury.
Which was pretty well all-consuming, 7 days a week, 16 hours a day, non-stop. It was very complicated, and it was very, very difficult.
Finally, the Treasurer and his team signed off on the Coalition's tax reform package with a 10% GST. Peter Costello settled on a date for the big day, the 13th of August, 1998.
Just down a doorstop. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I fixed the date of the launch for the day before my birthday. And this had killed me. This had absolutely killed me. I had done nothing else for over a year except pore over these numbers and these PowerPoints and these models. And I said to myself, I'm going to celebrate my birthday this year, so we're going to announce it on the 13th of August.
It was a big day, and Howard was there, Costello was there. I think Mrs. Howard was there at that one. So it was a big day for all of us.
Well, are we all ready? We got cameras. I can recall that day. I think I even had a new maroon tie. You know, I suppose it was because all the seats were all in Queensland.
So I had all of my PowerPoints, and you know, I was about to illustrate it. John Howard came in and did the launch. He was supposed to give a 10-minute introduction. I think he went for an hour.
And we'll be saying to the Australian people, we've got a plan and a vision for the next century. Our opponents just say no to everything. And I think that will be a very, very stark contrast. Thank you very much.
Even before the GST had been launched, tension between the Prime Minister and his Treasurer had surfaced.
I'm just going to do 5 slides now.
Pauline Hanson and her One Nation party had not gone away. They were proving a real threat to the government's chances at the next election. In May 1998, Peter Costello saw an opportunity to act.
Peter thought that she'd been allowed to gain a life of her own because there hadn't been a sustained attack on what she was saying.
Australia to me is my home, and my fellow Australians, my family.
The Treasurer decided there was something he could do. He'd direct preferences in his seat of Higgins to Labor ahead of One Nation. Peter Costello would put Pauline Hanson last on his how to vote card.
Well, at that stage, John Howard was saying we shouldn't allocate our preferences. Our position at that point was we weren't going to decide whether One Nation would go last, we would leave it open. I thought the argument was doing us damage. It was going on day after day, and I thought it had to be resolved. I couldn't announce what we would do throughout the country. I wasn't the leader, but I could announce what I'd do in my own seat.
A television interview provided the opportunity for his announcement.
I want to make it entirely clear that is not the future for Australia. The future for Australia is built on tolerance and respect.
After the interview, we went to Treasury Place, and shortly after, the Prime Minister rang and spent 45 minutes on the phone with the Treasurer. The Prime Minister clearly was not happy with what Peter had said.
I got the sense that he wanted to keep the option open of preferencing One Nation. I thought that was not a sensible option, that the controversy would be too great, that it was morally wrong, and it was politically wrong. And so I said, I'm not taking that option.
After he got off the phone, he sort of was a bit, you know, well, did I do the right thing? Maybe I shouldn't have, but we all felt he had, so he got his confidence back, I guess, and went on.
Well, I don't know that I remember what I thought at the time. I just remember having the view that we should have a blanket approach in relation to preferences.
Good day for a budget. It's a good day for a budget, yep.
2 days later, Peter Costello returned to Canberra to deliver the 1998 budget, finally wiping out Labor's $9 billion black hole. It should have been a moment of triumph for the Treasurer.
That was quite a tense party meeting because the Prime Minister was still not happy. The Prime Minister led a round of applause for Peter Reith for his handling of the waterfront dispute. And there was no sort of recognition for Peter of what he'd been doing and how hard he'd been working and, you know, restoring the finances and all that. So that created another little bit of tension to add to what was already there.
This morning, I called on His Excellency the Governor-General and recommended to him that the Parliament should be prorogued.
John Howard called an election for the 3rd of October 1998. In the end, the Prime Minister had no choice but to follow his Treasurer's lead. One Nation was last on the Liberal Party's how to vote card. But Pauline Hanson would not be the major issue in the campaign. This election would be a referendum on the GST.
How do I know you won't, in the next 2 years, up the GST?
Well, it won't even be introduced until 2 years' time.
The 10% will apply to funerals, and that is absolutely bloody disgusting.
The GST was a big political problem.
And if I wanted people to think one thing of it, I would want them to think that it was good for Australia.
Look, 3 days out from polling day, I said to myself, stop campaigning on tax, mate.
We're losing altitude very quickly.
We've certainly got the other side worried, and they deserve to be.
No, the adrenaline is keeping me up and elevated.
As the leaders made their final pitch, the influential news poll was recording a last-minute swing to Labor.
A lucky vote, Mr. Howard.
I hope so.
No, wrong timing.
Remember that next time.
Next time. Next time.
With us next.
I thought we could be a one-term wonder. Yes, I did, because the polls were not good. And there was a terrible poll that came out on the Thursday before the election that showed Labor at 53 and us at 47.
As the polls closed, John Howard was steeling himself for the worst.
I remember going to Kirribilli House on election night, and Jeanette Howard met me at the door and she said, he's just been given some exit poll figures which are not good. Go and cheer him up.
Linton Crosby rang me and he was a bit late and I knew it was crook. And he said 53-47 the wrong way, and I said, thanks a lot.
It's not often the Liberal Party does exit polls, but this one said he'd probably lose. And the first figures, we're in his study at Kirribilli House, and the first figures that came in were just awful. And there were very, very good soldiers losing their seat.
So I got the family into the green room at Kirribilli House and administered the last rites.
It had been a highly charged first term for John Howard. His mission to recast Australia had meant rapid and radical change. 3 years on, the question for John Howard and the voters was, at what price?